Hey everyone, and welcome to the 30 Days of Courage. I'm your host, Ashley Easter. I am the founder and executive director of Courage 365, and I am so excited to have you joining us tonight. For everybody tuning in for the first time, we want to welcome you. I know some of you have joined just to hear Noemi speak, and I'm glad that you're here, but I also want you to know that you have jumped in kind of the latter end of the 30 Days of Courage event that we have going on. So for the entire month of October, we've been having an event inside this group where on Friday nights we have speakers and interviewers coming in, and we've been talking about all different kinds of things about healing. So we are also doing self-care challenges. We have support groups on the weekends, free resources that we're giving away, prizes that we're giving away, all kinds of really cool stuff happening. So if you're here now for the first time, welcome. The free resources will still be available. You can catch up on those replays afterwards. And yeah, we're really glad you're here. And for those of you who have been with us the whole entire time, thank you all as well. It's been such a joy and pleasure being able to experience this October month with you, being able to have the conversations, be in the discussion groups. Without further ado, I would like to invite Noemi to the 30 Days of Courage. Hey, Noemi, how are you?
Hi, I'm doing good. Good to be here. Happy to see all these people in the comments.
I know the comments are like lit, and I see so many people joining in. Guys, please make sure that during this whole time you leave comments, you drop questions, because at the end we're doing a live Q&A after this interview portion. I'll scroll back through. Please use question marks on your questions because it's easier for me to skim through and find them when I'm going back. But at any time you can drop a question and I'll try to go back and find it. But Noemi Uribe, did I say that right? Okay. Noemi is a Hillsong survivor, an activist, and just an all-around amazing person. We're actually working on a project together that is exciting. We'll maybe be able to talk about it soon. But tonight, I wanted you to join us because you have a very unique experience going to Hillsong, the mega church, and leading that, doing your activism work, all these things. But even if people in our audience haven't gone to Hillsong, the church, there are so many through lines of how mega churches and small churches in general operate. And I just feel like you have such a powerful story. So that's why I wanted to interview on this, because I know whether people are familiar with Hillsong or not, they're totally going to be resonating with your story. So is that all right if we go there?
Yeah, that's great. That's what I'm here for.
Okay, awesome. So my first question is kind of for people who maybe have never heard of Hillsong, the mega church, before. I heard a lot about it kind of when I was starting to leave my cult experience. I grew up in a very conservative environment, and it was kind of, to me, in my mind, like this hip, at the time I saw it as sort of a liberal church. But I'd like to hear from you, what is Hillsong and how can people kind of have an understanding of what this place is?
Yeah, that's a great descriptor. To be honest, I also came from a similar background of growing up in a very conservative, very fundamentalist church, with my parents being in leadership and my parents pastoring and missionaries. So yeah, when I found Hillsong, it was also something that I saw as more liberal. So people would describe it as something more millennial driven, with more lighting and everything. But to give you a bit of history, it actually started in Australia about 30 years ago. So it was started by Frank and Brian Houston, and it's been spreading all throughout the world. And in the UK, in Israel, I believe Germany, all around the world you can find it. And it came to the US about 10 years ago. and it started becoming more popular in New York. That's where they first started their first campus. And in the US, they've expanded to California, Arizona. They used to have a campus in Texas and in Kansas and in Atlanta, Georgia. But since then, a lot has been happening in about the span of about 2-3 years. And they've closed down a lot of those campuses, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But to give
Yes.
you a bigger example of the fact that Hillsong is a global reaching church, and it's been shifting a lot lately, but they have reached many countries, many cities. They became more popular with their music, with people using or listening to their music, them winning Grammys with Hillsong United, Hillsong Worship, Hillsong Young and Free, which were focused on different demographics of young people or people in general. But if you were to walk into a Hillsong church today, or just in general, like the ambiance of it would be lighting. You would have a host greeting you at the door, sitting you down with a seat placement, so you feel very welcomed at first. And you'll see the signs "Welcome Home," so you'll very much believe it when you see it. And that was something that I thought at the beginning, but later on I learned there was terms and conditions to that. They're just invisible. So
Yeah. And kind of my perspective of it is it's almost like you're going to a church that's sort of like a rock concert. Like the sermons are a little bit short and it's kind of music, lighting, smoke, and kind of like is that am I getting the vibe right for that?
yeah, some churches are like that. The one here in Boston was definitely a little bit different, just because of the people that you find here in Boston. They're a
Mm,
lot more introverted. There's a history of Catholicism here in Boston, so they would use slower music, not as much of the mosh pit that you would find in New York or Australia. But there was that type of vibe that you could find, definitely, and they do play that type of music. So it's definitely going to a production, a concert, full on.
right.
The messages will be up to 30 minutes long, and that's it. So, yeah, it's pretty
Yeah,
much
I grew up hearing messages that could be like 45 to an hour, and then like you got multiple services of
yeah,
multiple sermons, and even just like hearing that like from somebody coming from backgrounds like you and I did, like very conservative. I think you were like super conservative Pentecostal, is that right?
that's correct. Yeah, I grew up
Okay,
in a Latinx Pentecostal Apostolic church
got it.
where they were put a start time to the service and you didn't know when it was going to
Yeah.
end.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I grew up independent fundamentalist Baptist, and so very conservative. Like, I think we used drums on Easter when it was like, he is risen, dun dun dun. But other than that, there was like no
Ah,
drums, that was like the one time you could pull them out. Um, and so when you like see the vibes, the social media, they're great at social media, like it looks super liberal, particularly compared to like the backgrounds that we came from. So that's kind of like the vibe. That's what it's kind of set. So, how did you first get involved in this church? And they've got multiple campuses. So, which one were you specifically a part of?
yeah, so I had attended, I had left my parents' church in college just for personal reasons. I didn't align with their theology anymore. So I had gone to Hillsong Phoenix about twice the summer before moving out to Boston for grad school. And I asked there, I filled out one of their prayer cards, just asking for help of like, I want to find a new church in Boston. I don't know if Hillsong is the right choice for me or the right vibe for me, but at least someone could help me pray. Um, so I filled out one of their cards, and when I got to Boston, I was just looking for a church. I ended up Googling and I found Hillsong. And I remembered that they had mentioned it in Hillsong Phoenix, that there was going to be
Mm,
a Boston branch opening. So when I got here, I remembered and I Googled and I found it. And they immediately, I got connected online. They have a website called, um, it's just like a hillsong.com website where you would
yeah.
fill out your profile. So I filled out everything there and I asked questions of like, hey, how can I get connected? So I was immediately connected. And the first day I went to one of their like youth connect groups, which is kind of like a small group. So I went to one of them and I saw the diversity there of people because that was very important to me, diversity of race and ethnicity. And so I thought it was going to be great. And
Yeah.
I started asking questions more about who they are, their vibe while we were there. And it was just going really well. It was just a hangout. And then all of a sudden, at the end of that, they encouraged us to go the following Wednesday to their first volunteer night, that they were going to introduce us. And if we wanted to volunteer at Hillsong, this was our opportunity to get plugged in. So I went that Wednesday. I was looking for a community. I was new in a city. I was new to trying to find a more quote unquote liberal church from what I had grown up in. So that's how I got plugged in. I went that Wednesday and I became part of the host team and started to be trained. And I was there in Boston at the first Wednesday night service,
Wow.
up to when we started launching Sunday nights. So I was there from the start, and I remember vividly helping out build up the church in Boston. Um, so that's kind of how I got involved and plugged in. It was more of just me searching, Googling, and seeing Welcome Home and seeing somewhat of a diversity and thinking that it was a welcoming and safe space for me as a person of color. When we go into my queerness, that's a whole thing that came a
Yeah.
little bit later, but those are the big criteria that I was looking for at the beginning.
Yeah, yeah, and we'll definitely dig into that in a few minutes. So like when you were drawn to Hillsong, like what was it that you thought you'd found in this community? What was something that you were like, "Oh my gosh, this is missing from my life. I feel like I found it here." What was that thing that you were like, "This is it."
Yeah, that's a great question. So thinking back at like how I had grown up in the church type of church I had grown up in, it was a very mono-ethnic church because it was a Latinx church. So you had a lot of mainly Mexican people within the church I grew up in, Salvadorians, a few Black folks, but the majority were Mexican Latinx people. And so that for me was it was okay and I loved it and the music was very charismatic and you would dance and like a little bit to the beat, but you didn't really get that diversity of worship that I was looking for.
Mm,
I believe that all people bring something different to the table in terms of race and ethnicity when it comes to worship. And so that was something that I wasn't finding. And I looked when I saw Hillsong, I thought that was a place where I could find that because that first meeting that I went to, I saw diversity in the leadership there. One of the leaders was Indian, someone else was Black, and there was another one that was like Latinx. So I was seeing diversity in white folks. So it's like, okay, everyone seems to be at the table here. And my second criteria was that everyone was welcome because the church I had grown up in, again, was very selective and very upfront and judgy of who would come through the doors. If you were wearing pants when you walked through that front door as a woman, they would stare at you the whole time and judge you for wearing pants because
mm,
you were supposed to wear a dress or a skirt. So in a place where Hillsong is telling me, "Welcome home, come as you are," I thought that also meant externally of what I was wearing, and so that for me was like big things of like, okay, this is a great place. A lot of people are here, a lot of diversity, a lot of welcomeness. It feels like family, and those are the things I was looking for. Moving to a new city, across the country, and I didn't know much about it. So I was excited to find a new family, a new place. And I thought I had found it in Hillsong.
right. And it's like instant community when you join a church, especially a big church like that. Like instantly you have people to have as friends and, ministry partners and, just all those things. And then, like you said, the aesthetic of it was very much what you were looking for. And we'll talk about how the aesthetic didn't necessarily match the internal values, but like on the surface, it looked like everything you could dream.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's something they don't really talk about, the conditional welcomeness. Uh,
Mm,
they often will, if you fit the stereotype of a straight, cisgendered, um, white passing person, they will definitely welcome you in and you'll feel like nothing is wrong in the church. And I've experienced people who've said they've never experienced anything bad there. And I'm like, I'm glad you did it. We don't want people to.
right.
But if you don't fit that stereotype, you do get that conditional welcome of having to fit in a box where you don't belong.
Yeah. Yeah. And before we kind of dive into your story a little bit deeper and kind of where you started to see the toxicity, I was hoping that you could address maybe some of the stuff that we've been seeing in the media. As I'm looking at the comments, people are saying that they've been following Hillsong, seeing the stuff in the news and listening to different things about it. Can you kind of give people who maybe haven't heard anything about that an overview of like, why has Hillsong been in the news for the last couple of years? Like, what are some of the things that are happening?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, Hillsong wasn't in the news before about 10 years ago, at least, maybe in Australia, but not here in the US.
Yeah.
And news in the US travels all around the world pretty quickly. So the reason why we've been seeing it a bit more is because there was a pastor in New York named Carl Lentz, and he was able to get connected into celebrity circles. So we would see him pastoring Justin Bieber, the Kardashians, Kevin Durant, people like that that were rarely prominent would come into church as if nothing. They would come in through the back door with some security, and they were able to worship there, which I thought at the time was really good. And that's pretty awesome that they could find a place where they are also welcomed, because church is made up of all types of people, or should be made up of all types of people. But that also brought with it some sort of second class attendance or membership at a church, where then certain people were receiving more of VIP service, and the pastor then started using that label as well. So if he was out on the street, paparazzis would follow him because they knew he was quote unquote Justin Bieber's pastor, or he was Selena Gomez's pastor. So he started taking on that persona. So when he was fired in November of 2020, I believe, if I'm getting my dates correctly.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he was fired for several things, and the biggest one was having an affair with a woman that later opened up about it in the news. So he kind of posted on social media that he was leaving, and then the church also let out a statement. And this was in the midst of like the elections of 2020, which were very contentious and very intense here in the U.S. Not going into politics, but it was a rough time for everyone.
Yes.
And so that was something that really shook the church. People were not expecting that. People had their identities centered on Carl Lentz. And the media picked up on that. And so we started seeing reporters, and we started hearing about documentaries being done, investigating into what was happening. So that's where I kind of got more involved when a reporter reached out asking if I knew Carl Lentz. I was like, I don't know him personally, but he's talked about me, so sure, I'll talk. But that was pretty much it. And it kind of just snowballed after that, where after Carl Lentz was fired, they started investigating New York a bit more, and they started noticing that it was a lot more than just Carl. But they were trying to pin it on Carl. The church was, at least in their PR. So we started seeing nannies who were coming forward saying they weren't paid the same amount, or at least a livable wage, or anything. We started seeing volunteers coming forward and sharing their experiences, with me being one of them. We started seeing churches being closed down in different spaces. And then right before the documentary for Discovery Plus was going to come out in March of last year, or this year, I'm sorry, we see then Brian Houston, one day before, announced that he was also resigning. And then it came out later that he had some moral failings or different things like that, where he had assaulted basically two women, and they had opened up more about it. So then he ends up resigning, and it's a whirlwind of things. So that's more of the history you see here in the US, or of the media. History-wise, there is a lot that's been happening since the foundation of Hillsong.
Right.
And trigger warning to a few words of abuse, especially child abuse. Frank Houston was known for sexually assaulting children, and male children. And that was something that Brian Houston covered up. And so now he's being charged in Australia for that. And there's a court case that's going to be happening in December. We don't know the outcome of it. And I don't want to speak too much into it, not knowing too many legal things about Australia, but it's the news that's happening right now in Australia of him, um, of the Australia uh, Royal Commission trying to keep him accountable for not coming out with his, speaking about his father and knowing and hiding it.
Right.
So that's a little bit more historically of what's been going on, and kind of like more recently with what's been happening here in the US.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a really helpful overview. And it seems, in my opinion, that the whole system is built on a lot of corruption, a lot of people who there's questionable things about money, questionable things about how volunteers are treated. Certainly, a lot of allegations that I view as very credible around abuse and sexual misconduct. Um, Sometimes the media likes to present affairs when people might be more accurate in saying that it was assault due to power differentiation. So there's a lot of allegations out there, and mixed with that celebrity, um, just that celebrity platform that comes with it, and then all the scandals. It's really, that's what probably people have been seeing in the news. And kind of to bring this forward, we kind of briefly mentioned it, and I talked about this in the promos, but you were actually featured in the Discovery Plus documentary that
Yes.
came out. And so you got to speak about your personal experiences, and that's really what I'd like to kind of shift the conversation to focus on, if that is all right by you.
Yeah, let's go there.
Okay, so everybody make sure you keep dropping your questions in the comments. Please use the question marks so I can make sure I can find them easily when I skim through, and we'll get to your questions after we complete this portion of the interview. But Noemi, I do want to shift to your personal story, because this isn't just something that you see in the news. You've been an activist speaking out about things, but this hits home for you. And so I want to ask, like, what was the tipping point for you? What were the things that led you to realize this was a toxic environment? This wasn't what I thought it was. And in fact, maybe I don't feel like this is a place where I can feel safe.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I had been involved in Hillsong for about a year when I finally started opening up about my sexuality, going to my leaders, asking questions about the church's policy, mainly for my own purposes. I had grown
Yeah.
up as a pastor's kid, and I wanted to be able to respect whatever policies they had and ensure that if I didn't align with them and who I wasn't okay with me being my full authentic self, then I was okay walking out the door, even though I had invested a year at that time into it. So I started having those conversations, but I started noticing that there was some pushback of questions not being answered, of policies being very ambiguous, of becoming of, well, it's dependent on the pastor you're working with, or it's dependent on how you or what you're volunteering in. And so those things were creating more questions than they were giving me answers. So I was really confused and asking all of these questions. And I started to notice the different people who were then starting to ghost me within the community that I thought was my family. And what I mean by ghosting is them just like not talking to me anymore, all of a sudden just cutting me off, and not understanding what was happening. This all started to affect then my mental health, and I having experienced some trauma as an adolescent, and more specifically some religious trauma as a kid and adolescent. It was starting to revive that and bring that up again. And so I started to have a lot of downtime of like not doing well mentally. So I started to go into therapy, and I found a therapist who aligned with all of my identities, with me being a queer person. My therapist was queer as well, with me wanting to talk about religion. So I found someone who I felt connected with me and I could connect with them. They were Latinx as well, which was a big part of me being able to do that openly, culturally. And so I started asking questions there, but I didn't feel as comfortable to share some personal things that were happening in my head. With more specifically and trigger warning, suicide ideation, just to keep it general. I was starting to notice that something was happening that was getting a little bit dangerous, and I was getting scared. But I didn't feel comfortable explicitly telling my therapist that it was happening. So I went to the only other people that I felt comfortable with, and that was the church. So I opened up to my leaders and I shared with them what was happening and the fact that I was feeling like I was falling into some suicide ideation. And they kind of didn't take it in the best way. From my perspective, it was more of leading me into doing devotionals or praying or doing different things, which is okay if it's accompanied, obviously, from my perspective, with mental health professionals. But when they were only encouraging that to be the only thing, that's when I personally didn't find it helpful for me. Um, so I ended up having to be admitted into a psychiatric hospital just for my own safety. There was a night where it was just getting really bad. And one of my friends who didn't go to the church, she was a friend from grad school, she asked me if I wanted to talk to her aunt. And to give a bit of context, her aunt was a lesbian woman, Black woman, who's pastoring a church here close to Boston in Somerville. I had met her before, but I didn't know much about her. So I end up getting on the phone with her because my friend got me on the phone. And the first thing I remember hearing was, it sounds like you've been having a really hard time. And so she really, really humanized my experience of having a low mental health crisis. And she really changed the way I viewed myself. And she made it more of an illness rather than a responsibility for me to heal, which it is our responsibility. But when you're going through a crisis, you need some support that will be more humanistic. So she gave it to me in that way. And I responded, yes, I'm having a hard time and I don't know what to do and I need support. And I started crying on the phone with her, and she said, I completely understand. And it sounds like you need some support that's more professional, that I can't provide you, people around can't provide you, but a mental health professional, maybe in a hospital, can provide that for you. And so I agreed to it, and she gave me directions exactly on how to go about it, from getting an Uber, going to the hospital, walking in the front door and saying, I'm here for a psychiatric evaluation, and them taking it from there. And she let me know kind of the big overview of what was going to happen. That really eased my anxiety of going to the hospital and getting an evaluation, because there's a lot of stigma behind it. So I went forward and I did that, and my friend went with me, and I felt so much better when I was at the hospital. That's when I kind of started coming to the realization of the communities I was surrounding myself with. On the one hand, I had my friend who was from grad school and her aunt who were so supportive, and my therapist who were all finding ways to keep me in a place where I could find some healing and I could find professional support in that. And on the other hand, I had my church community whom I thought was there for me as well. But the reality is that they weren't showing up the ways that I needed them to. No one went to the hospital to visit me other than a friend or two, but no pastors or major leaders went to go visit me, send me a card, send me flowers, nothing. And so that was something that was very eye-opening for me, having grown up as a pastor's kid, going with my dad to hospitals, going to visit people on their deathbed or just going through a crisis. And we would show up with food and some flowers or something to comfort them, to be there for them as a community. I wasn't getting that from my church. The church that I was investing my time and money and my effort into, I wasn't getting anything in return. And in return, I was receiving judgment. I was receiving backlash. I was receiving conditional love because of the ways I was identifying, and from their perspective, choosing to identify as a queer person. So then that for me was all kind of a turn of perspective. And I ended up leaving the hospital in July of 2021. And I started asking more, no, I'm sorry, July of 2019. I started asking more specific questions then after leaving, and doing my research and finding more about queer theology, and coming to a realization that being who I am is not a sin, and God created me just as I am, and that's perfectly and wonderfully made. And so I started approaching my conversations with pastors in that way, who at their time were trying to mentor me into identifying as a child of God instead of queer. And so that for me was very difficult to experience, having to be in those debates almost with my pastor, whom I should be able to have a good conversation. The debate was more of like a confrontation. So by December of 2019, I was riding on a train home one day, and I was crying after church as I usually did on my ride home, not understanding why my body was feeling the way it was. And having experienced some like healing or some form of calmness at the hospital and wanting to recreate that outside of the hospital, I started to ask myself, what were the things that I needed to give up and sacrifice in order for me to feel and come to a better place in my mental health, that I needed to put myself first. And that I didn't want to feel this way anymore. I didn't want to go back and start feeling suicide ideation, or start feeling another crisis coming in, another major depression episode. So I started to think through as I was riding in the train, crying my eyes out in the back. And I came to the realization that it was church, and that maybe I should not go to church one day, and more specifically Hillsong Church. And so I didn't go the following Sunday, and I went to a park, and I hung out with my friends, and I slept in, and it was life-changing. And from there on out, I went on December 29th, and I spoke to my pastor, the one who was mentoring me, and I officially let him know that I was leaving. And that was it. And I left officially. I did go back two or three times in February of 2020. But by that time, I was more visiting friends than going as a leader or mentor or member. So that was a big part of the turning point of what got me to leave.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. I realize, I mean, that's a super vulnerable story. And there's so many things that stand out to me. One is just the atrocious way they handled you coming forward about a mental health crisis. And I want to kind of get into that a little bit. But the other thing is, I think I heard you say this on another podcast, but you were not hospitalized because you were a queer person.
No.
You were hospitalized because of how people were treating you because you're a queer person.
Yes.
And I guess my question with that is, when you came to the church with the mental health concerns, when you talked about your true identity of who you are as a queer person, and they responded the way that they did, like, that feels dangerous to me. Like, do you agree? Do you think that, like, if other people were to have those things, like, I can't picture it going well. I mean, it just, I don't know. That's not even really a question, but it feels like that's super dangerous.
Yeah, it is. It's
Yeah.
very dangerous, and it was dangerous. Yeah, like you said, it wasn't my queerness that took me to going to the hospital, but in the mentorship I was going to, they wanted to convince me of that. They were saying that it was because I was insisting to identify the way I was, which was really frustrating to me, because I would look around me and say, no, it's your rejection. It's the ways that you're approaching our conversations. I'm okay with who I am. I'm learning to love me. And from their perspective, because of the theology they were believing in, of dying to oneself, of disconnecting with one's body, that was what they were asking me to do. And that was the opposite of what I was finding in Christ and what I was finding in Christianity. That God created me and I was created good. So then why am I viewing myself as bad? Why is that a bad thing? And so when I started working through therapy and started to heal and started to view myself as good, I started to come to the realization that just I wasn't loved despite of my queerness. I was loved because I was queer as well, just as any other person. And so that didn't align with the way that the church was showing me the conditional love of you can only be loved because you're straight. And your mental illness is being affected by that. And so by me being able to debate back and say, no, I don't agree with that. And here's the scriptures and here's what I've been studying. And I had done this in undergrad studying religion and having done some study of theology with my family. I was coming to that and coming with them with theological perspectives and saying, we can differ on this, but you can't disagree that we are made good. And so that was something that was really eye-opening for me in the ways that they viewed mental health, coming from a church that says that they are better together and they do movements for mental health. When they don't have trigger warnings for videos that are talking about very explicit traumas in their church playing. And I would bring it up and say, this is very dangerous. You're triggering even me and I'm coming to you. And they were saying, no, we want people to be triggered so they could come to us and ask for the support. Wow. So that for me was very uninformed care, very uninformed pastoral care. And it was very dangerous to have any approach in that way, that with people who were unqualified to do so.
Right, right. And you were on a podcast, Cults to Consciousness, with Shalise Ansola. She actually was one of our previous speakers. I guess it was last year for the 30 Days of Courage. And am I remembering correctly? Would you categorize the quote unquote mentorship that they gave you as a form of conversion therapy?
Yes, I do. So after leaving Hillsong and going to therapy a bit more, I started talking to my therapist about what had happened. And I started to view different folks and different activists who had gone through conversion therapy themselves. So I started asking myself those questions of, what I went through, was that conversion therapy? So I came to the realization in talking with all of those people that what I was experiencing was a form of conversion therapy. Modern conversion therapy now is not going to a facility to get quote unquote reparative therapy, what they like to call it. But it's now viewed in a very different light, and it's viewed through in churches, they do it through mentorship. They do it through programs where people are saying they no longer identify as LGBTQ or as part of the community, and they have been changed by God. And so a lot of people are having to struggle with the fact of it being something that they have to do as well. If someone else is able to do it, that means it's attainable. But the reality is very different. So yes, it was a form of conversion therapy. I wasn't the only one in Hillsong. I heard about many other folks who later came forward to me and said they were experiencing also what they were calling mentorship, and asking them trying to convince them to identify as a child of God, not as queer, as if those were mutually exclusive.
Right.
So that was something that was very eye-opening to me. And I started to see that it was more systemic than it was just a one-off.
Yeah.
So
it's like somebody telling me I can't identify as a person with brown eyes. I need to identify as a child of God. It's like, what does that even mean? Like, what? Yeah, and I think that's really helpful to people, because rightly so, it often comes to our minds, conversion therapy being, like you said, going to some camps. I've heard horror stories about like the different, physical torture treatments, but churches like Hillsong get smart and they're like, oh, that's not culturally acceptable anymore in a lot of places, and we'll get called out on that. How can we do this in a way that's going to be sort of undercover? And so I think that's really illuminating, and it is a form of abuse. I mean, getting you to deny who you are. Okay, so we've talked about kind of how they proceeded when you talked about mental health and those types of things. They basically were going to give you Bible study materials. What do you feel like are some of the dangers that could happen when a church, not just Hillsong, but a church in general, tries to take on a therapy role when they're not a therapist? Like what could happen? Because I think there's two different things that can be at play. One is there can be complete ignorance around mental health, and so harm can be done that way. Or it can be what I've seen, what I grew up with is, there's a lot of, shaming of, therapists. And so it's like, you need this instead of that. But whatever it's coming from, whether it's ignorance that, oh, I can help somebody fix this, or whether it's like an all out rage against true mental health care, like what are some of the dangers of a church trying to take on that responsibility when they're not equipped to?
Yeah, it's a great question. It is very dangerous to have a church say that to have ill-equipped people think that they can support someone or with a mental health crisis and experiencing a mental health illness. And it happened to me, and I think that's when we have ill-informed and ill-prepared pastors and leaders, it can lead to the worst form of outcome with death, unfortunately. And it has happened within the peer community, where I'm seeing my peers dying because of the way we were approached, and the way it is approached. But I think from my perspective, what I can speak on from my perspective, what I experienced was people believing that mental illness was spiritual warfare, which for me is one of the most dangerous ways to approach it. I was being asked and being in a PTSD flashback, asked to fight the war in my head for the demons who were causing me to experience that. That is the last thing someone with a flashback needs to have, someone yelling at them to get out of it. And that for me caused more trauma than it did help in any way. And I have had to recover for those episodes of people yelling at me in an episode. And so when we think about pastors and how they could be better prepared, this is something that pastors who go to seminary, pastors who go through certifications on how to support people, have an understanding that they have a limit, that they don't know everything. And that's okay. It's okay for a pastor not to know something and say, let's find the answer together. And maybe you need some professional support. It's okay to have a list of therapists in the area that could guide someone through better support. That's how it was for me when I found this other pastor who was LGBTQ affirming and said, I can't help you, but I know of a place who can, and we're going to get you there. And I'm happy to support you spiritually through your journey and say, listen to what they're saying, and you should get the support you need from a mental health professional. So it was very different. And I noticed that the stark difference, the day and night, of one telling me, let's go to the hospital, listen to your therapist. How can I support you through that? Will church and a church community be able to support you through that? To another one yelling me through an episode and saying, I'm going through spiritual warfare, and saying that I need to be able to get myself out of this flashback. It was night and day. And so for me, that brought me to the realization that it is very dangerous not to have that. And if I wouldn't have had that pastor who was affirming, who guided me to the hospital, I wouldn't be here today. And I've told her directly, and I've thanked her for it. Because if I would have continued to go through the other thing, I would have felt like the war in my head was being lost, and they were, in whatever they were calling it, was winning. And it was better for me to rid myself and give up. And so that's what happens with a lot of people. And that is the dangers of not having mental health professionals, or at least pastors who are okay with you approaching mental health with a mental health professional.
Yeah.
And that's part of what I'm doing now, and I want to do in the future. And as a public health professional myself, having received my master's in public health, um, wanting to better prepare people, and leaders and pastors to say it's okay to not know, and it's okay to find guidance elsewhere. You are not a therapist. You can be a guide and hold people's hand through the journey, and that's
Yeah.
okay. That's enough.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I'm so glad that you're here. And what I'm hearing loud and clear from what you just said is you got to know your limits.
Yes.
As if somebody's going to be a clergy person, you have to know what your limits are. You have to know what you're equipped and qualified to do and what you're not. And I know even in some seminaries, like looking at the Southern Baptist Convention and their seminaries that they don't necessarily teach you what your limits are. And so even some of these seminaries are not being clear about these things, or haven't in the past at least. And um, I would just personally warn anybody here, before you take your mental health concerns to a pastor, you first take them to a therapist if possible. And before you get involved in a faith community, if you decide to get involved in a faith community, check out how they're going to act and respond around these things. Ask some questions, because, like you
Yeah.
said, it can be life or death.
Yeah.
Um,
I think, if to add on to that, I think the biggest thing that I always tell people as a public health professional is, if you go to a medical doctor, your primary care physician, for a cold, or because you have a runny nose, or because you broke your leg, and you go to a hospital, the same, your brain is also a part of your body, just as your arm and your eye and your teeth are.
yeah,
And it's okay to go to someone who's qualified and who's received that qualification through years of study, and who has been approved to be able to support you in that. It's as if it was another doctor just for your brain, and your
yeah,
brain also needs some support and some healing and some medication sometimes to chemically balance however your brain is going about and viewing the world. Your brain is a very
yes,
powerful organ, and you
yes.
need to care for it as well.
Yes, absolutely. Yay, therapy, yay, medication, all the things, yes. So I have several more questions, and I want to get to the Q&A. So I'm just going to kind of ask you to maybe answer some of these a little bit rapid fire,
Okay.
just because I think I really want to get through these, but I also want us to save some time for people to drop their questions in the comments to be able to engage. So one is, it seemed like Hillsong was really ambiguous about how
Yes.
they view the LGBTQ plus community. And I think that's really common for a lot of churches that, present like mega church style, whether they're large or small. Um, how do you feel about churches being ambiguous about their beliefs around LGBTQ individuals?
That's a great question. It is very dangerous for a church to not have clearly stated policies. Because if I would have known that Hillsong was not LGBTQ affirming from the start, we wouldn't be talking here today. I wouldn't have experienced the traumatic events that I did. Uh, LGBTQ people want to know if it's a safe space or not. And if it's not, that's fine. Continue to be homophobic and do your own thing, but at least I won't have to be there.
Yeah.
Um, and I think am more I feel better about people who show their homophobia up front and say they're LGBTQ, not they're non-affirming in their website, and say this is how we view people. I'm like, great, that's not a space for me. Have a good day. Believe what you want to believe. I'm not here to change your mind. Um, and I think that's what happens with ambiguous churches, where they don't state their policies. They want queer people and allies to come through the doors and give their money, and without the honesty, there could be a lot of harm that happens, just like the ones I went through, where you want to go up in leadership and you want to support, you end up coming out and your case is completely different, and you go through things in forms of conversion therapy the way I did. I'm not the first case that it's happened in, and Hillsong is not the first church that has done it. So it's very dangerous.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. Another rapid fire question. How did the church react when you decided to leave?
They were not very happy because they knew I wasn't going to stay quiet. Uh, I remember the last day I went, a lot of people weren't talking to me anymore because they were distancing themselves because I was starting to be blacklisted. Um, and when I went to the pastor and I let him know I was leaving, he asked me if I was going to another church. And I said, not right now. I feel like I need to heal. I don't know if I'll ever go back, but as of right now, no. And I don't really care for it. And he told me, wow, that's really, really sad. And I said, why? I'm happy. Like, I'm okay. Thank you, though. And so I remember him saying, well, this is your home. And there's going to be a lot of people who don't come through those doors because you're gone. And I said, wow, that's very manipulative. And
good for you.
Yeah.
I love the boldness.
Said, this isn't home for me. Because if it was home, all of me would be welcome. And it's not. So I'm going to go find my home. And I left.
I mean, that's just like a mic drop moment. I love that.
Yeah.
Go you. How has the church responded to the Hillsong documentary?
From what I've seen in the media, because they don't tell me directly, they know it's not in their best interest because I'll screenshot it and send it to her. But what I've seen in the media is they are not happy with the production that put it together. Mm-hmm. We saw current interim senior pastor Phil Dooley try to tell people that they're trying to paint the church as bad and destroy the church. That's the PR approach they're giving. And then immediately say, but look at all the good we're doing, and use children of color and organizations in Africa and India to say they're doing good things for donating money to them. So that's blatant racism. And that for me was very not surprising, unfortunately, but it was very frustrating. The fact that it got to that point and they still don't recognize that they are being held accountable, and it's okay to say, we fucked up. An apology for my word, but it's the reality.
Yeah. No, that's, oh, gosh. I mean, I'm not surprised, but wow, it's just the boldness. Yeah. So I've had a little bit of a personal connection with Hillsong. I never attended the church, but I think it just almost shows the power of influence they've had in American evangelical culture and obviously in other places in the world too. But I was drawn in by their social media. And Christine Kane, she's one of the pastors, I was a total fangirl because I had never seen a woman preach before. And that was actually very liberating compared to my background where women could not be pastors or leaders. And that was completely like earth shaking and just like, wow, when I heard her speak at Liberty University for the first time. I heard Carl Lentz speak. They were just so charismatic, and I was just drawn in, and I was so impressed by it because I'd never seen anything like that, especially not from a woman. And so I started following everything on social media, everything that she did. And there was a couple things that happened, but one, I started seeing news articles about her plagiarizing an abuse survivor in her book. And that didn't sit well with me. And then when I heard the allegations of cover up with Brian Houston covering up for his father, and I didn't see her posting and speaking out about that, that was like a shot to the heart because she was like, her platform was about being a survivor kind of thing. And so I had written a blog post about her in the past. I'd been the first one to shoot up my hand and ask a question when she did a Q&A. So we'd had a voice-to-voice conversation. It was in a large crowd. But so I wrote this blog post about how disappointed and how heartbroken I was to see this behavior. And Brian Houston, he blocked me on Twitter. She blocked me on Twitter. He tweeted at me before he blocked me. And I was just like, how do you have the time? You run a global church and you're going to tweet at me because I was shocked by that. But it really hurt because I felt like I'd lost something and I hadn't even been a part of their in-person community. It was just an event I went to and then online social media. So I guess kind of my question for you is like, what would you say to people, whether it's Hillsong or a different community, what would you say to them if they feel like they have lost people that they looked up to, a dream that they had for a religious community, promises that they were given? What would you say to those people who feel like they have lost that sense of community?
Yeah, that's a great question. And welcome to the club of being blocked by Brian Houston. I'm also part of that club. And there's a lot of us who are. Yeah, that's a great question. I think as someone who grew up around pastors and leaders who are put on pedestals, but I can see them as a human at home or in the background. We in Christian spaces tend to idolize people. And I think there's a danger to that because no one is perfect and everyone's going to fall from their pedestal. And it's a lot of responsibility to hold that, to have other people see you and look up to you because they have high expectations of you. And then there's people who take that and run with it and use that to have power and hide their imperfections in order to maintain that idolization from others for themselves. That's narcissism as well. And that's a mental illness that needs to be treated as well. And so I think from my perspective, things that I always tell people is they're human. They're also going to make mistakes. It's very dangerous to rely on people for mentorship or to view them so highly because eventually it's going to fall. Whatever goes up has to come down. That's something it's a saying in Spanish and I love to bring it up all the time. And it's great to look up to people and respect them. I have mentors and I look up to certain leaders, but I also have to remind myself that just as much as I'm a human, they're also human and they're going to make mistakes. The difference with a lot of these people like Brian Houston, Christine Caine, is that they're, like I said, they're using that idolization from other people to hide a lot of the ways that they're viewed and to hide by blocking, by sending NDAs, by sending cease and desist letters.
Yeah.
And that's where it's a very different level. They're trying to maintain this PR view of themselves. And those are the leaders that we have to be careful of.
Yeah.
And realize that they're not doing it for people. They're doing it for themselves then. They're doing to lift up their name and their view of the world. And that's very different. That's very dangerous. And I would then encourage them to look for people who are doing the same amount of, or the same type of work in other spaces.
Right.
But like here in Courage 365. So yeah.
Yeah, that's so good. Okay. Last question, and I'm going to start polling questions from the comments. I've seen several come through. So guys, if you haven't dropped your question yet, about to go into the thread and poll from those. But my last one, this is a little bit less of a question, more of just like a topic of conversation that I want to get your take on because I also want to maybe vent a little bit. One of the things I loved about Christine Caine, what drew me to her, was not only did she identify as an abuse survivor, she was a woman who was in roles of leadership that I had been told as a child women couldn't be in. But then she also had an organization called A21, and it was supposed to be an anti-sex trafficking organization. But one of the big ironies, or maybe that's the right word, was I started hearing stories about what people have described as exploitive labor practices for volunteers in the churches. And comparing that, and sex trafficking isn't the only kind of trafficking. There is labor trafficking. Yes. And just, again, these are allegations. I just want to be clear with that. But I'm seeing a lot of parallels in the stories of how volunteers are treated, how the nannies are being underpaid by these multimillionaire pastors, and then looking at an organization that's supposed to be against human trafficking. Like, am I the only one seeing the irony in that?
You're not.
Okay.
You're not, because I know some of the nannies. I was a volunteer, and there's a lot of labor abuse and a lot of like they survive on free volunteers, which can be viewed, and I never thought of it that way, as trafficking in a way, because you are basically trying to bring in people, and encourage them to volunteer as well, and to give up hours on like their whole Sunday and sometimes 2 or 3 other days during the week, to give free labor to the church that is bringing millions of dollars in. But we will never see one penny of it, of course. And yeah, I think it is a big irony, and it is frustrating to see people like Christine Kane now not turn and say something to survivors who did experience the form of human trafficking within the church. I don't think I've seen any leader within Hillsong say anything. We saw something come from Terry Christ in Phoenix, but it felt very performative, and I'm not sure how I feel about it. I'm also very hesitant with people. And within Hillsong, and Phil Dooley said, if you feel like you experienced that, I'm sorry you felt that way. I'm like, that's not an apology. So I don't know. I feel like people like Christine Kane, it's very frustrating because they built their platform, like you said, plagiarizing other people and trying to block the ways that people are responding and saying, hey, you're not saying anything, and you're also encouraging and enabling this.
Yeah. Wow. Okay, well that's the end of my questions. I'm going to scroll through, and we have so many comments here, which you're definitely going to have to go back and look at them all because they're really good. Thank you all for participating in this conversation. Okay, first question I've got here is, anyone heard of International Churches of Christ? I guess that was a cult type group they were in. Maybe that was just for the comments, but are you familiar with that, and do you see any parallels?
No, I have not, but I'm happy to look in after this.
Okay, cool. Scroll down. Okay. Are you worried, concerned about your safety by speaking out?
I was at the beginning, because I still live in Boston, and I've seen a few of the leaders. But I also know that I have my voice.
Yeah.
If anything does happen, I have people on speed dial, if we still want to use that word,
Right.
that I could text over and say, this just happened. My voice is powerful and my story is powerful, and they know that. And that's why I get trolls and people creating fake accounts to send me messages instead of the actual person sending it. So I was at first, but thanks to therapy and a lot of work, and building up a sense of security around me, I no longer feel fearful.
Very good. Very good. Are you part of a religious organization now, and do you still identify as Christian?
That's a great question. I don't. I'm not a part of anything right now. I don't know if I'll ever go to a church again. I have gone once before. The first time that I went into a church was when we filmed the documentary. That was the first time I ever walked in because it was recorded in a church. But I haven't attended anything formally seeking to be a member. I personally don't feel the need for that right now in my life. If I did, maybe in the future, but no.
Got it. Thank you. Where do you find a sense of community now if you're not in a church?
Yeah, so I was fortunate enough to have a few friends outside of church. I lost so many, and I get the feeling and the fear of leaving community. I've lost hundreds of friends, and I was fortunate to connect with people outside of that who are also speaking out. and I'm friends with now ex Hillsong survivors. And that's been a form of community. And we invite other people if they're leaving and they need support. We're here, like we exist, and we will support each other through difficult times. We may not be there physically, like in person, but we're there virtually in the best ways possible. Um, I've also gotten myself out there and I've been a part of organizations. I am currently a commissioner for the state of Massachusetts, advocating or working for LGBTQ policies in the state of Massachusetts. Um, and I've met so many people there and I have so many friends, and I'm intentional about the people I seek to become friends with now. Um, so, yeah.
That's great. I love that. I think building other communities is just really important. It leads into the next question. It says, how did you feel safe about being in a community or being close to other people after your experience?
Yeah, it did take a long time to be able to feel safe making new friends, because that was definitely a trauma response of like closing down, being fearful. Um, I worked in therapy for months on end, almost 2 years, to be able to feel safe. And the biggest thing that I remember my therapist encouraged me was, like getting to know them and being a little bit vulnerable, to see if they were vulnerable back, and
Yeah.
then slowly building up the relationship and asking hard questions, because relationships are also built on that, through supporting each other and realizing that you have friends for different circumstances.
Mm.
Some people can't take hard conversations, and that's okay. You only hang out with them when it's fun and you want to grab a drink or you just want to go play board games. And there's friends who you can have deep conversations with. So it's okay to have friends for different things. So yeah.
That's really good advice. I think people tend to think you've got to find a friend who is everything, but that's just not how life works generally.
No.
um, are your family members supportive of you?
I am fortunate to say now, yes. When this all started, when I came out in Hillsong, I also came out to my family, which kind of added on to my mental health crisis,
Mm.
because they were not accepting. I didn't talk to my mom well for about a year and a half, almost 2 years. Uh, but they came to the realization that love needed to be stronger than anything. And they started listening. And I quarantined with them, and they got to see that I hadn't changed. They just knew a little bit more about me. And that was something that was very transformative in our relationship. So they ended up actually leaving the church we grew up in because they were still attending. Uh,
Wow.
so they ended up leaving, just seeing my experience, and seeing their treatment of it, have supporting me through it. And so they decided to step away and are now either um, trying to find a new church or just like not really
Yeah.
feeling that they have the need for it anymore. So yeah, they're very supportive now.
I love that.
And
That's
I fully
really
recognize that I'm privileged in having that. Not a lot of people have that.
that's really
So
beautiful. Yeah. Any suggestions for questions survivors should ask and red flags to watch for? So I guess like if they're maybe considering a faith community, what would you say would be red flags and maybe questions they should ask before like jumping in?
yeah, I could definitely provide like some questions coming from, if you're an ally, an LGBTQ ally, or an LGBTQ person. Some of the big questions that I ask within that are, does this church perform marriages for LGBTQ people that are openly queer? Will this church hire someone who's openly LGBTQ? Um, will they allow someone to be a part of the membership or leadership within the church if they're openly LGBTQ? Those are some of the things that I found if I'm looking for a church that's fully welcoming of all people. Those are the conversations. Usually, they'll say yes or no, because they're yes or no questions. If they're trying to beat around the bush, they're most likely trying to be ambiguous, and their response is no.
Yeah, that's good. There's a organization called Church Clarity where I think you can put in
Yes.
requests for them to kind of ask some of those questions for you.
Yeah, I've also made resources in my Instagram where you could find them. One of my posts talks about that, like what questions to
Okay,
ask or to find out if a church is affirming or not. And it's for allies and LGBTQ people to learn how to ask those questions.
cool. Do you still keep in touch with the female pastor that helped you?
I do, yes. So she's actually also in the project that Ashley and I are working on. We're very close, and I actually just applied to theology, the School of Theology here at BU, and she was my pastoral reference for that. So I'm very excited. She's amazing.
That's really cool. Did it take you a few tries to find a therapist that was helpful for you?
Yes, I did. Like I said, I was looking for someone who held the criteria that I was looking for. And I was very specific in that. And it's, as a person of color, it can be hard to find another therapist that's a person of color. But I was fortunate enough to find someone. We were, it's like a relationship. If it doesn't work, it's okay to cut it off and move on. But my therapist and I were together for about 4 years.
I love that.
But I decided to, I started noticing that I wasn't feeling comfortable sharing deeper things because I didn't want to let them down. And so
Mm,
that's when I knew it was time to move on, that I needed to find a therapist where I could share deeper things. And it's okay if you outgrow a therapist and you feel like you need
yeah.
someone who can help you in a different perspective. You can do that. I literally have an assessment on Monday for a new therapist. So let's see how
That's
that goes.
introvert or extrovert?
I'm actually an ambivert. So I am right in the middle. Any test that I've ever taken, I'm always like 48 or like 51, whatever. Yeah, I really move my personality changes based on what's around me. Hillsong was a very extroverted church, so I introverted a lot there just to like level it out.
Yeah.
So yeah.
If you're comfortable sharing, do you still believe in God?
That's a great question. I think not in the ways that a more or regular person believes in God. I do believe there is a divine or a form of a divine, um, that is a spiritual being, that is beyond our understanding of gender and identity. Um, did they create the world? I don't know. That's a mystical, and even if you study Genesis, that's a Babylonian creation story. Um, so yeah, I do believe there's a form of a divine out there, and I seek the divine in the spiritual ways that they have manifested to me. Like God um, shows up to people in their own way. And in discovering my indigenous ancestry, and trying to dig deeper into that, I think I have found the divine and spirituality in the ways that my ancestors connected with their ancestors and God. And I find it to be a beautiful thing, and to see God in nature and to see God in love, in communion with others. And so, yeah, I don't feel like I view God as a he or as a she. Yeah, I believe he's beyond gender. And so, or they're beyond gender. So, yeah, I view them as a divine.
That's really beautiful. Yeah.
And I believe that the divine is within all of us. So there
Mm,
is, because if we were made in God's image, there is the divine in us. So we are also divine.
yeah. I am a quantum physics geek. I'm not a quantum physicist, but I think my definition of God is like the energy that is everything.
Yes.
It is in us, it is all of us, it is everything, and less of
Yeah.
a person and more of a existence. But we welcome people to have other perspectives here. Um, Love that you also are honoring your ancestors and your background. That's really beautiful. So thank you so much. I know we've had people asking in the comments. We've kind of dropped hints that there's a project coming up.
We can say a little bit.
We can't really say too much, but what I would say, and then let you add to this, is it's kind of a big deal and
Yes.
it's pretty exciting. And when it comes out, it's going to be all over our social media. We just like contractually not really supposed to say anything yet. What would you
It'll
add?
be out soon. Well, you'll know a lot more very soon, hopefully. We just don't know when it's going to come out, so we don't want to keep people's hopes up of it coming out and then it not happening. So
Right,
we're just
exactly.
going to wait off
Yes.
and say things when we are told we can say things. So yeah.
Absolutely.
Someone asked in the comments, what is your heritage?
Oh, yeah.
So I'll just share a little bit. I am Mexican, Mexican American because I was born in the U.S. in Arizona, but Mexican because my parents are from there. I lived in Mexico, and my grandparents from my dad's side are indigenous. I don't know what specific tribe because they assimilated so much due to colonization and assimilation, or their language. So that is something that I've been seeking to look into from a young age. So I'm trying to tap into that, my curiosity that I've had since I was a kid. So yeah.
That's really beautiful. Thank you for that. Well, is there anything else you want to say? Anything that you'd say to our survivor community? I'm just so grateful that you're here today.
Yeah, I think your journey is whatever and the ways that you create it. But healing is a lifelong journey, and don't feel like it's a race to get there. We're all going to get there in our own time and however we get there, but it's always going to continue. Life is beautiful, and our reason to live and our purpose to live is just to live and love and express all of who we are. And the more healing we could find, the better we can express the divine of who we are and the divine of who God created us to be. So yeah, just, you got this, and keep going.
Thank you so much for that. And definitely, I'd love to invite you all to really just check out everything that Noemi's done. So the Hillsong documentary is on Discovery Plus. Noemi's got Instagram, great stuff there. Definitely follow there because when we can tell you, we will tell you, and it will be all over our socials. So, yeah, but I just want to thank you so much. It's been wonderful chatting with you today.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm very glad that I was able to be here. And I hope this can help at least one person.
I know it's helped many people.